Rebekah Roth here again, and I want to share a story with you, and it's about 9/11, and it's about what happened to me, and it's about some of the things I uncovered. So buckle up, it's kind of an interesting story. Because I just kept on digging and digging into this story, I couldn't believe what I was finding. I was actually encouraged by people who apparently were trying multiple ways to stop me from digging into 9/11. I had a lot of experience inside cabins in airplanes. But some people decided they wanted to call me an anti-Semite. And it was so weird because I had written 5 novels about flight attendants and a pilot friend of hers who kind of step by step discover what more than likely really happened on 9/11. They were novels. They were novels. It had nothing to do with Jews, or nothing to do with Israel, and nothing to do with hating Jewish people. And I kept being accused of being an anti-Semite. So in a sense, those accusations actually sparked my curiosity, actually from just looking at it at 19 radical Muslims, causing me to eventually look toward Israel and any possible connection that there might be in the whole 9/11 event. I couldn't understand. Nothing I'd written about was against Jews. But once I'd seen proof that there were no Arabs on the planes, and the hijackings were basically just some bogus, trick. I thought it was trick photography when I saw it. But, that did explain why the crew didn't follow hijack protocols. If there were no Arabs on those planes, there were no hijackers, but there was somebody doing something. And why Betty Ong was so confused whether they were being hijacked and what was really going on. And she voiced her confusion. At one point, Betty said, "We don't know who stabbed who." And she didn't know if they were being hijacked or what. She was so confused. But as I went over before, if you've got a hijacker, you know about it. I had to rethink that day and what probably happened because, again, the hard thing for me to remember was there were no Arabs on board. I discovered a trove of FBI documents. They were actually transcripts from security people at American Airlines. And in those documents, I discovered that one of the flight attendants had initially claimed that the hijacker, remember Betty called him a he, was seated in seat 9B. Later, the flight attendant said the hijackers were in both 9A and B. And the other seats listed were not seats that were even on that configuration of that aircraft. I'll tell you an example. Amy came back and said that there was a hijacker in 10C, but there's no seat number 10C. There's 10A and B, and then the aisle, and then D and G. I was really drawn to look at that because to look into 9A and B. And why is that? Well, because we, flight attendants, are trained to be accurate and extremely specific in giving out any information about weapons, whether someone had a gun or a bomb, and to really be accurate. And no flight attendant would make the mistake of claiming that 2 people, let alone 1, was a hijacker if they weren't confirmed to be a hijacker. And there's a reason for that. We don't want innocent people to be killed once the plane is landed. Also, the flight attendant, Amy Sweeney, said that one of them, speaking of the hijackers, spoke good or perfect English. Well, none of the accused 19 that they told us were on board spoke good English. None of them. Most of them didn't speak any English at all. But 9B, he was an American. The story says that Daniel Lewin, who was the passenger in 9B, and Edmund Glazer, who was sitting next to him in 9A, were the passengers. Well, 9B had grown up in the United States in Colorado, as a matter of fact. And 9A had grown up in South Africa and Rwanda or someplace. And he came to the United States when he was 17, so he would have brought with him an accent. Not perfect English. Initial reports didn't say much about either one of these men, but especially didn't say much about passenger 9B. He did have the most unusual FBI 302 I've ever read, and there will be more on that later. I'll do a show on the whole thing. It's so fabulous. In most news articles, he was only referred to as a husband, a father, and a businessman. Occasionally, someone would have included that he had been a soldier. Maybe it was mentioned periodically that he'd been a soldier in Israel, but nothing that might set off alarm bells if a person were beginning to question or be suspicious in the least bit of the official 9/11 story. Nothing. Very interesting. Again, the 302 is fabulous. But sometime clear in 2013, about 12 years after 9/11, an American journalist wrote a book about passenger 9B. It was titled No Better Time, with a very long subtitle. Well, after her book was released, it was very interesting that several newspapers and magazines ran excerpts and stories built on this passenger in 9B. The internet was flooded with this Israeli hero. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting because I didn't know any of this. It told a very interesting story and one that caused me to really question the story of his supposed death. Remember, he was supposed to have been killed. The book really glorified this guy, giving him the honorary claim of the first victim to die on 9/11. And that was the headline in many of the newspapers. He was the first victim to die on 9/11. There was such a flurry of news and magazine articles about this guy that I got that "thou protestest too much" feeling in my gut, and I listened to my gut. His fellow soldiers back in Israel said that this guy could bench press 300 pounds at the age of 16. And he could kill any human being with a pen and a credit card. And of course, he would have had both of those with him on this business trip. If not, take him out with his bare hands. So my question was, well, why didn't he? Why didn't he do that on Flight 11 then? And how did an Arab passenger who was not on the plane or on the passenger manifest manage to kill this man? Did he really die? How did that work? Of all the passengers, this guy was a highly trained assassin himself. A member of the most elite Special Forces unit known as the Sayeret Matkal in Israel, in the Israeli Defense Forces. Revelations from this woman's book only bring up more questions, but we're told that he had his throat slit by a guy that wasn't even on the plane. This is pretty crazy. And when you put all the pieces of this puzzle together, remember, in the official story, the guy that supposedly slit this man's throat, the assassins, he had the wrong person's photograph in his passport. The passport photograph that he had in his passport, the FBI tells us, that's the passport that was found down on Vesey Street or Murray Street, and it was handed over to a policeman. It was completely unharmed from the crash, from the collapse of the building, and from the fires. Not a singe mark on it. But the photograph in that passport belonged to Salem Al-Hazmi, who was supposed to be on American flight into the Pentagon. But he wasn't on that plane either. He wasn't on the manifest either. What? So can you see now how it's starting to look like maybe something else was happening? like an intelligence operation, perhaps. 9B was one of those elite hostage rescue guys. That was one of his specialties. He would even know how things worked on a Boeing aircraft. Things like the doors, the chutes, the PA system, how to get on a PA and make an announcement to calm down. We have some planes, we're going back to the airport, like that. In magazine articles that came out about this guy in 9B, what a genius he was. Well, again, there were so many articles about him that all came out around this same time that I began to feel like I was, maybe me and the public, were being brainwashed to believe something that wasn't true. Well, longer story short, this guy's marriage had fallen apart. He was living in a bachelor pad. He'd made a ton of money when his company went public. He was chasing women, buying motorcycles, and out there being a young billionaire in that .com era. And he was not the family man that his obituary said at all. And this is what the book told us. Then the book told us this. His stock in that company fell from $327 a share down to $5 a share in the summer of 2001. How he had taken multiple trips to Israel in the months preceding 9/11. Now, back to my wheelhouse. The book also claims this, that he took that flight to Los Angeles an average of 2.5 to 3 times a month, and that he, quote, knew all the flight attendants. Well, if that were the case, if he were such a frequent flyer, I am here to tell you, if that were the case, we would known everything about him. The flight attendants all on that plane would have known his name, his typical behavior. If he got on that morning flight, they knew who he was. They knew he liked to, for instance, skip breakfast, and he only wanted to sleep for the first 3 hours. And when he woke up, he wanted an orange juice or a coffee or a Bloody Mary or what have you. We would know this guy's behavior, and we would know his name. The crew would have not only known this guy's name, but his habits. I mean, that's what we do with frequent flyers. And that meant that Amy Sweeney and the other flight attendants would have used his name, not his seat number, when pointing out who initially she said the hijacker was in 9B. And he spoke good English, and he was a native speaker. They would have been shocked that a frequent flyer had become a hijacker. They would have said, Daniel Lewin, our frequent flyer in 9B, he's turned on us. He's lost his mind, whatever. At some point, by this time, bells are going off in my head. Because this story just did not and still does not ring true. And you can see why. Because her story is in complete opposite of what would be happening on the plane. They would have known this man. So let's take a quick look at 9A, Edmund Glaser. He was born in South Africa, came to the United States to go to college at 17. So he would have had an accent, unlike 9B, who didn't. He worked for a company, now this is really going to take you for a ride, called MRV Communications, located in California. And again, not much information was out about him either. I remember when I first looked at all the passengers. For quite some time. And then I did find the name of the CEO of his company, Noam Lotan, as it was in the newspaper, and he was notifying his employees that Edmund Glaser had been lost on Flight 11. And I found that, and of course I saved it because I have boxes of these data. I looked up the company to find that it was actually an Israeli company. Still, it didn't dawn on me. I didn't put any pieces together. But the chairman of the board was a man named Shlomo Marglit. And he had been a professor at Technion University in Israel. Well, Imagine this. That's the very same university that the passenger in 9B attended before he came to MIT in Boston. Well, that was an interesting and odd connection. But that wasn't the end of it. At some point after this last battle between Israel and the Palestinians that started on the October 7th attack in 2023, I found another article. I rented this article from a Southwest Florida newspaper. And the newspaper article was titled, "Former Israeli intelligence agent," that would be Mossad, "living in Southwest Florida, has a loved one injured in the front lines." And it was written by Wink News Digital, dated October 10th, 2023. And this article read, Wink News spoke to a man born in Israel who was a veteran of the Israeli military. He was desperately trying to get out of Israel a loved one, a relative, who was in the army and on the, fighting for her life. It was a girl. And then it went, Noam Lotan lives in Fort Myers. And 50 years ago, he was in uniform fighting in the Yom Kippur War. I said, Noam Lotan? Well, he was the boss of the man in 9A. I remembered his name. An Israeli Mossad agent. Now, what a coincidence is that? I'm not suggesting anything, but I'm recognizing a coincidence. So over on Flight 11 in row 9, seats A and B, we had a highly trained assassin, a hostage rescue guy, an Israeli elite commando, and another guy sitting next to him whose boss was also a Mossad intelligence agent. Now, I just have to ask, what are the chances of that? Not only that, but that information was not made public for over 10 years after 9/11. Yeah. Now remember, the flight attendants first said they were, 9B and then 9A, were the hijackers. I keep asking, if this wasn't a hijacking, there were no Arab hijackers on the planes. We now know that for sure. Was it some type of intelligence operation? And in fact, we've been lied to all this time? Is that why they're hating me? Is that why I'm being called an anti-Semite for writing novels about a flight attendant and a pilot as they go through all the data about 9/11? I have to ask, and you'll find the answer.